You've just tipped 85 litres into an 80-litre tank, and the obvious conclusion is the filling station is ripping you off. But that's bullshit. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, the place where Australian new car buyers save thousands off their next new cars. Hit me up on the website for that. Last episode, we heard from Paul, who's a guy with a Patrol, and he claims that he can go to several servos and decant 85 litres of diesel into his 80-litre reserve tank. Obviously, they must be ripping him off, right? And I'd suggest au contraire. I mean, petrol and diesel, fuel generally, is the ultimate grudge purchase, right? People hate buying it. And that's why conspiracy theories around fuel pertain, right? Because the only reason you buy the stuff is so that your vehicle does not turn into expensive roadside friggin' furniture. So whenever I talk about this stuff, and I've done this issue several times on national television, we've done endless scientifically controlled fuel consumption tests. We've tested fuels against each other. We've tested the amount of fuel that service station pumps decant, right? And there is no conspiracy, but I understand how people think this, and it's really because we need more scientific literacy in the community generally. Because if you do this stuff, if you measure the fuel and draw conclusions, you're doing an experiment. And experiments only work if you can establish control and derive good data from which you can then go on to draw conclusions. So let's talk about that. A lot of people tell me that this issue is all about, in part at least, thermal expansion, either of the tank or the fuel. And I just want to set that aside briefly, okay, because it's got nothing to do with that. Although the thermal expansion thing is kind of interesting if you like that physics in a beer garden kind of analysis. So I'd suggest that here in Australia, it's pretty easy to have sort of a mean sort of temperature throughout the year of about 20 degrees, but a lot of variation. It could go up to 35 or even hotter, or down to 5 or even below. So it's easy to be in a situation where your 80-litre tank, which might be standardised at 20 degrees or 25 or something, could go up to 35 or 40 and could go down to 10 or 5 degrees and have this sort of 15 degree C variation. And thankfully, you know, the thermal expansion of a steel tank is easy to figure out. Same with aluminium, and the same with those plastic fuel tanks, right? The thermal expansion, volumetric expansion coefficient of these materials is well established. And if you look at a 15 degree C variation just for the tank itself, okay, a steel tank is only going to change by 40 millilitres, right? That's bugger all. 40 millilitres in 80,000 millilitres is insignificant. I think you'd agree, right? It would expand if the temperature increases. It will contract if the temperature is lower over time, right? But that's the volume change, right? And it's proportional to the temperature. So another 5 degrees is going to be another third on top of that. It'd be 50 odd, 55 millilitres, something like that. Aluminium expands about twice as hard as steel, so 80 millilitres for that. Still reasonably insignificant in the context of overall proportional expansion of the tank. And the plastic tanks, plastic expands a lot more, obviously. But 240 millilitres, let's call it a quarter of a litre, is still only 1 part in 320-ish for the tank. So the change in volume of the tank with temperature is insignificant. The fuel's interesting though, because fuel expands about 4.5 times harder than water does, liquid water, through temperature change. And if you go through the same 15 degrees C ambient temperature shunt for the fuel, then you're going to change the volume by about 1.1 litres. And this happens all the time, okay, because you can pull the fuel out of a tank somewhere, you know, and it's in a reasonably isothermal environment throughout the whole year, right? It's probably at 15 or 20 degrees C or something down there in those double-walled subterranean tanks. And when you get outside, it could be 15 degrees colder or 15 degrees hotter. The temperature change is going to be 1.1 litres. But that's not going to be significant during the filling process, because the fuel, 80 litres of fuel, cannot change by 15 degrees C within the 2 or 3 minutes it takes you to tip the fuel into the tank. It just can't happen like that, because it would require the fuel to absorb or emit heat energy, depending on which way the temperature is going, at such a high rate. If it's 3 minutes and you've got 80 litres of fuel and the exterior surface area of the tank is about 1 square metre, then you're looking at 10 kilowatts per square metre worth of either emission or absorption by convection, radiation and conduction, okay? And that just won't happen. It's 10 times as severe as incident sunlight energy. So you can forget that in the 2 or 3 minutes. What's far more likely to happen is if you top the tank right up, if you're really stupid and OCD about it, and you top the tank right up to the point where, you know, the meniscus is visible once you pull the spout out, then once you pull the nozzle out, then basically you could park off to the side and go and have a burger or something, and the fuel will expand over the next hour, and you could tip 1.1 litres of petrol or diesel all over the road. Thermal expansion for petrol and diesel is roughly the same. So I just want to put that to one side. It's got nothing to do with thermal expansion. So I guess the next thing we've got to talk about is the construction of a fuel tank and how that impacts on doing a physics, chemistry in the beer garden experiment. Because if you're using your fuel tank and a fuel bowser as the equipment in an experiment, then what you've got to do is you've got to establish what's called experimental control, right? And experimental control is really simple to understand. It's where you keep everything else controlled except the thing you want to measure. So what we want to measure is how much fuel the bowser says it is decanting into your tank. You've got to keep everything else controlled though. So you've got to keep the definition of empty. So you're going to fill up when the tank is empty, and you think to yourself, well, that's okay, I got 80 litres on top of empty for my tank, right? That makes sense, I guess, conceptually. But you've got to be able to repeatably establish the same point for empty. So a fuel tank works like this, okay? This line here is the bottom of the fuel pickup. So you've got your filler, comes in like this. You've got your fuel pump pickup line that goes to deliver fuel to the engine, right? It's a pretty basic thing. So you've got this unusable fuel space down here, and basically you've got a vent space in the top here, which is 7 to 9% of the volume of the tank. So you've got your 80 litres of usable fuel in here, but the tank is actually much bigger than that because there's this unusable fuel space down here, and there's another 7 to 9% worth of the total volume up here. So there's a few things that impact on this, right? If you're using the fuel gauge in your car to determine when the tank is empty, then you're really playing this game with only half a deck. It's very difficult to establish experimental control there, because you've got to think about how a fuel tank and a fuel gauge works. You drive along, the fuel gauge goes down and down and down and down and down to the point where it goes empty, okay? But empty is not really empty. It's not really right down here at the bottom of the fuel pickup, not unless you run that car on a level surface to the point where the engine stops, okay? And I'm tipping Paul is not doing that. You wouldn't want to do it with a diesel anyway, because then you'd have to bleed the injectors back up. Even if they're auto bleeding, it's a pain in the ass, all right? So what manufacturers actually do is they get their gauges to indicate empty when there's still plenty of usable fuel here. So empty might be somewhere up here. You know, you might have 5 litres of fuel to go. So you can drive along, you can get to empty, you can look down and go, oh, that's empty, I best do another test. But you've really got no way of looking inside the tank and measuring the level and ensuring consistency of the empty point. So that's an experimental control fail right there. You know, you might have 5 litres up here, you might drive for a bit and then look at the gauge and it's empty. You might have 4 litres, you might have 3 litres, and I think you'd agree that that accounts for a great deal of experimental variation in these kinds of measurements. The other thing you've got to do to get this right is establish experimental control at the full point. So what is a refill on the tank, and what is 80 litres? So 80 litres is the notional capacity of the tank. You've got to have the vent space up here to manage thermal expansion of the fuel, and you've got a filler neck that could be Christ knows what volume, you know. You've also got, in particular with diesel, that foaming capacity. So let's think about, and you've got this vapor recovery system as well. You've got a vapor recovery system in the vehicle, and you've got a vapor recovery system like a little vacuum cleaner in the nozzle of the fuel pump, okay? So all of these things are impacting on your ability repeatably and controllably to fill the tank. Basically, what happens is, if you're one of these people who shakes the car side to side, you're going to establish a bit of a wave in here, right? And what you're going to get is an air bubble is going to release itself and come up through the filler, and all you're going to do is compromise the vent space to get more fuel into the tank. And you don't want to compromise the vent space. All fuel tanks have vent spaces. Portable fuel tanks have vent spaces, right? This is a 20 litre portable plastic fuel container. There's 20 litres. There's the 5 US gallon mark, which is, you know, roughly similar, okay? So this is an airspace, it's a vent space, so that when the fuel expands, if you pick it up out of the tank and it comes out at 20 degrees C and it's the middle of summer and it's a 35-degree day or something, you don't want to open this nozzle and have, you know, 1/4 of a litre of fuel just erupt all over you, or even 100 millimetres, because if there's a source of ignition, that's beyond enough to kill you. I mean, petrol in particular is dangerous stuff. You know, the flash point is super high, it's easy to ignite. And if you end up in that situation, you know, static electricity spark, bit of an eruption of fuel out of here, it's vaporising straight away. If you just go and breathe in and you breathe the radiating plasma of the fire into your lungs, that's going to work out really badly for you. So this is why there is this vent space engineered into every fuel container, the tank in the car, the portable containers that you might use for outback trips, even the little containers, you know, the little 5 litre ones that you might use for mower fuel. It's got a vent space, and certainly you could put 22 litres or something in here. That's just a bad idea. So I'd suggest that the same concept plays out with the fuel tank in your car. It may say 80 litres. You can get maybe, you know, if it's 7%, 7, 8, 56, it's 5.5 litres worth of vent space in here. You can compromise that if you're a habitual filler. You know, if you go for 10 clicks or something, you can fill up the filler pipe as well, and there might be another 2 litres in that. And depending on the foaminess of the particular diesel, that's going to be another variable. You might lose a little bit of fuel down the vapor recovery system in the car, and if you go the refill process to the click and the refill process to the click, and you do that 12 times, every time you do that, the little vacuum cleaner in the nozzle is sucking up a little bit of fuel into the pump's vapor recovery system. So I honestly don't know how you could establish experimental control in this way. If you want to see if a pump is ripping you off, the only way to do it is to decant a controlled volume of fuel and measure it in a scientifically accurate measuring flask. And I absolutely would recommend that nobody does that. Do not attempt this, particularly with petrol or gasoline, because it is preposterously dangerous stuff. And the reason it doesn't seem dangerous is because the systems that are in place, right, for refueling are so good. The systematic protection is so good that nobody pays attention to it and they don't think it's dangerous. The fuel itself is spectacularly dangerous to handle. Diesel's not quite as dangerous as petrol, but I would not worry about this. The one point I would make about this, you'd be surprised how many servos I can decant 85 litres into my 80 litre tank. The tank is designed to hold only 80 litres of usable fuel. So if you are jamming 85 in there, this is not evidence that the pump is under-delivering, right? It's not a rip-off. This is evidence that you are overfilling your fuel tank, and that generally doesn't end well, okay? It's a bad idea to overfill your fuel tank. And those times when you can't jam 85 litres in there, it's just a matter of empty being at the absolute first point of empty on the gauge, and your empty point is actually the highest possible empty point, not the lowest possible empty point here. There's a great deal of variation there, and also up here in the vent space. So this is all about being rational, all right? There's no evidence that there's any conspiracy at fuel stations the fuel gauge in your car is not an accurate measuring instrument to tell when the fuel is down here, you know, and the volume that the manufacturer tells you, that 80 litres, is the fuel, the safe fuel contents in the tank, all right? It's not how much you could hypothetically jam in there if you try really, really hard.